Without further ado, I would like to speak to you about the global and the national migration crisis because it's actually the 10th anniversary. And maybe you didn't even know it, but we've been in a global migration crisis for 10 years. More than 304 million people worldwide are international migrants as of June 2024, according to the United Nations. A number that has doubled since, let me check, 1990. And migration has proven dangerous, as you know, and even deadly for those on the move. Nearly 70,000 people migrating internationally have died or disappeared since 2014, when the UN started keeping count. While crossing the sea, as you see in this slide, traveling through inhospitable landscapes, in detention and elsewhere. And in 2023, it was the deadliest year on record, with nearly 8,600 deaths, a 20% increase. Crossing the Mediterranean Sea is the most dangerous route. And that's what these folks are doing here, coming from North Africa to Italy. I want to spend a moment looking at the numbers. Of those 304 million people on the move, 122.6 million people are considered forcibly displaced as of the end of June 2024. Now, this is a result of persecution, conflict, violence, human rights violations, according to the UN Refugee Agency. Global migration flows saw a resurgence in 2012. And I don't know if you can see, I placed a red circle around that dot for 2012 because this is where it really starts to take off. This was after a period of stagnation due to the 2008 recession. The UN Refugee Agency said that 42 million displaced people were on the move in 2012. And this included increases to the United States for traditional reasons of family reunification or economic opportunity. But it also started to include people going to some new countries of destination, places with growing economies like Brazil, China, and South Africa. And we also saw a big jump in the amount of money that migrants were sending to their families in their home countries, called remittances. There was also a new refugee crisis coming out of Syria, and those folks were going to Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. But the global migration hit crisis level in 2015, which is the other red circle here. And as you can see, it takes off like a shot to the moon after that. This is when large-scale movement of refugees and migrants started headed towards Europe. And then people started talking about global migration crisis when the UN Refugee Agency publicly announced that there were now 65 million displaced people. So we saw a dramatic increase in the numbers flowing into Europe, primarily via that Mediterranean Sea route, with many fleeing conflict and persecution in countries like Syria, Libya, and Afghanistan. 1 year later, 1 year before that, in 2014, those of you who were here in El Paso were very much aware of a surge. That was the word of the year, a migrant surge at the border. And it was a shift from single men coming across the border to very clearly families, and then most disturbingly, the unaccompanied children, who quickly started to overwhelm Border Patrol because there are tighter rules and regulations about the care and keeping of children in border detention. And these children primarily were coming from the Northern Triangle, as you all are, I'm sure, are aware, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. And what we saw on the US-Mexico border shifted from a migrant surge very quickly to a humanitarian crisis. And I'm sure you remember the children who died in detention at that time. And I'm remembering it was about a dozen, and nearly all of them were from Guatemala and not Spanish speakers, right? Indigenous. So there's a lot of nuance to that story and lessons to be learned from that. So thinking about the global migration crisis, you see on this map the main routes that migrants are taking. 122 million people forced to flee their homes due to violent conflict, disasters, economic and political upheaval, making that decision that to leave is a safer bet than to stay. It's important to note that within that number of 122 million, we have an all-time high of internally displaced persons, IDPs, right? So if you talk to people who work in this field, they quickly say IDP, internally displaced people, 71 million. They are the green line on this chart. The blue line, the second one, is refugees. I'll speak about them in a minute. Now, internally displaced means they're forced to flee their home, but they don't cross a border, right? So the vast majority of the forcibly displaced are within their country, but desperate for humanitarian assistance and safety. The countries where most of where IDPs are the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ukraine, Colombia, Yemen, Sudan. And what's driving this rise in IDPs is not just violent conflict, it's climate-driven natural disasters. And we heard from a speaker yesterday, that's a thorny issue at the United Nations. If we expand the definition of what's a refugee to a climate refugee, that opens a whole can of worms. Mainly because it's millions and millions of people. So no solution yet on that one. Just know that disaster displacements rose by nearly 40% in 2024 compared to 2023. That's a crazy increase. Now, thinking about refugees, the lesser number of the forcibly displaced. So 43.7 million refugees as of June 2024, 65% from 4 countries alone: Syria, Venezuela, Ukraine, Afghanistan. You've probably heard from the current president, these 4 countries whom he plans to send people back to. 32% of refugees are hosted by 5 countries: Iran, Turkey, Colombia, Germany, Uganda. It's been difficult on the politics in Germany if you followed the political backlash to their stepping up to the drastic increase of migrants coming to Europe. And then down here it says 40% of refugees are children, the most vulnerable among us. With the weakest voice, not at the table, or the decision-making table. You've also probably heard of refugee camps. Well, only 1/5 of refugees live in camps, and it's hard to know how many camps are there around the world. It's approximately 500 camps. And the 5 largest refugee camps are in Sudan, Jordan, a couple in Kenya, and then Bangladesh. Now I want to point out, there's a group of camps in Kenya that are on the sort of the middle of the country, the east, closer to the ocean. And the living circumstances there are very difficult. In 2023, the whole year, cholera outbreak, measles outbreak, and drastically high levels of malnutrition because of climate-driven heavy rains that make it hard to grow food and then to manage the latrines. Less than half of the refugees have access to a toilet. these are not acceptable conditions. And then in Bangladesh, you're probably aware of the Rohingya coming out of Myanmar to Bangladesh, and the fires that have happened in the main refugee camp in Bangladesh that have just burned down the dismal shacks that people have to live in there. So one disaster after another. And Bangladesh, being at low sea level, is very, very prone to flooding. What makes people, as you probably see, come to the border here also makes people leave their homes worldwide. There are push factors and pull factors, right? What's pushing you to leave are, poverty, high taxes, unemployment, overpopulation, discrimination, no access to medical care, war, oppression, violence, corruption. And then what's pulling you to a specific country? Well, I'm sure you're aware, for the United States, a predominantly family reunification, education and job opportunity. Well, this is true worldwide. Human nature is what we have in common, and acknowledging that migration is part of the human condition because we are connected to one another. I want to share a story because I think Pope Francis' visit to this small island off of Italy really encapsulates what's going on with the global migration crisis. So Pope Francis visited Lampedusa, Italy in June of 2023. It was his first trip outside of Rome. He had only been Pope for a few months. And he came to highlight the plight of migrants and refugees who were coming by flimsy inflatable boats from mainly Libya, North Africa, to the closest island they could reach off of Italy, which was Lampedusa. Many were dying on the journey, and it was starkly visible.
Let's just stay here.
To have these deaths apparent at the sea. Also, Europe was shutting its doors, overwhelmed by this amount of people. And so it was quite controversial. So he came to highlight their plight, to mourn their deaths, and to call for compassion and solidarity. While the Pope's visit was only half a day, his message, preached over just a few hours on a sweltering hot day in July of 2013, set the tone for his whole papacy. He called out a culture of comfort that stops us from responding to the need right before us, which makes us think only of ourselves, makes us insensitive to the cries of other people. These were Pope Francis's words. Later that day, at an altar made of a painted boat, the Pope celebrated a special mass for forgiveness of sins, to mourn migrants lost at sea and search for a better future, to lament a world that had neglected their plight. And that year alone, some 8,000 migrants and asylum seekers had arrived on this tiny island, and at least 500 had been reported dead or missing the year before. Pope Francis said in his homily, "In this globalized world, we have fallen into globalized indifference. We've become used to the suffering of others. It doesn't affect me, doesn't concern me, it's none of my business." It was a brave action by a global leader. He also came to Juarez. I imagine some of you were here when Pope Francis visited Mexico and celebrated Mass along the border wall. This image here is from Juarez looking into El Paso. And here Pope Francis called for open hearts, to recognize migrants as victims of exploitation, as individuals with a story, not a number or a wave or a tsunami or an invasion, all these words that politicians have been throwing around. but individuals with a story of incredible exploitation. He called for us to open our hearts. So what's driving this crisis that really took off in 2015? Obviously, conflict and violence, persecution and human rights violations, poverty, lack of opportunity, climate change, natural disasters, political instability, repression. And I'd like to speak about persecution. What is that about? There is a legal definition of this persecution, based on ethnicity, religion, sexuality, political opinion. What are the impacts of the crisis? Well, starting first with the migrant himself. This is a photo of migrants from Eritrea protesting in a public park in Tel Aviv, Israel, 10 years ago. They face dangerous journeys, lack of access to basic needs. They are vulnerable to exploitation and violence. What's the impact on host countries? This is a news article, migrants sleeping on New York City sidewalks. So even the great city of New York, overwhelmed by responding to the needs of migrants. And this is a New York Times article about the deal that the UK tried to enter in with Rwanda. So the international implications of responding to the global migration crisis. Rwanda says it doesn't have to repay the UK for its scrapped migration plan. The UK had said that they would ship asylum seekers that they were rejecting to Rwanda. They're saying that the UK forgot to enter a little clause in the contract that said, we'll pay you back if you don't follow through on it. And they had an election and their politicians changed their mind. Great tension. Millions of pounds lost from the UK to Rwanda. So the chaos from a leading country, yes? Where are the migrant crises that are happening today? I'm going to name some countries, but I want to stop and say the theme running through all of them is protracted conflict. Conflicts are just going on and on with no solution. That's a big problem. And it's a lack of international cooperation at the UN level to solve these geopolitical tensions. And the burden is placed on the individuals in those countries. So the Sudan refugee crisis, since the conflict in Sudan began in April 2023, more than 12.5 million people are displaced. Most of them still inside Sudan, but 3.4 million fled to neighboring countries. The Venezuelan migrant and refugee crisis, I imagine some of you are friends with Venezuelans who have come to El Paso seeking refuge. They're driven by economic collapse, political repression, lack of basic human rights, and they're looking for safety and economic security as well. The Syrian refugee crisis, this has been going on since 2011. The civil war there has resulted in a massive displacement of people, millions seeking refuge in neighboring countries and beyond. More than 1 million Syrians have returned since the fall of Assad in December, just a few months ago. But as of early January 2025, there are still 13 million Syrians who are displaced, and approximately 6.2 million of them living as refugees in neighboring countries. I mentioned Bangladesh. This is a photo of a Rohingya people, and this was one of those instant refugee crises. It seemed to happen over a weekend. Persecution and violence against the Rohingya Muslim minority in Myanmar has led to a large-scale exodus to Bangladesh. And the Central American migrant crisis. I'm not gonna get too much into this because I know our other speakers will, and actually you could probably speak about it better than I. It's a large scale movement of people, primarily from El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, fleeing violence, poverty, lack of opportunity, looking for a better and safer life in the United States. This is a photo from, I'm trying to remember, 2016, about 125 migrants who, as you know, walk up to Border Patrol and say, I seek asylum, and an orderly process in the hopes that the rule of law will come through for them. What has been the response at the global level? I've already spoken of Pope Francis. He is the leading global leader speaking faithfully, on point, and clearly about the migration crisis. He offered a 4-verb framework: welcome, protect, promote, and integrate. So if you return to your parish or your community and you're trying to write up a work plan for a program to respond to the needs of migrants and refugees in your community, I want to suggest Pope Francis's 4-verb framework. If you focus on these 4 verbs and then flush out each one, you'll be on the right track. And work with partners in your community, because you can't do it all, right? But each of us has a role to play. Now, the rest of world global leaders have gotten together at the United Nations in 2016 to form the Global Compact on Migration. This was during the first Trump presidency, and there were high hopes. This was pretty soon after the Paris Climate Agreement, which was a grand success. And Pope Francis was a positive influence and motivator for the Paris Climate Agreement when he released Laudato Si just prior to that. And he just really gave everybody energy and momentum, even the Pope's on our side. So there was a similar hope for this global compact on migration. And a credible rumor was Pope Francis wanted to attend in person in Morocco. And then the news came a few months prior that the United States was pulling out. Because the focus of a global compact for migration was, according to the UN leadership, to prevent suffering and chaos with 2 simple ideas. And I'm going to read these 2 simple ideas, and you'll know why the Trump administration pulled out. Number 1, acknowledging that migration has always been with us, but should be managed and safe. And number 2, national policies are far more likely to succeed with international cooperation. They went ahead and they held, I want to say it was nearly 190 countries who in the end signed on. They held an important conference in Morocco, came up with 10 guiding principles and 23 objectives, and it's still in place today. These 10 guiding principles are based on a human rights-based approach for regular and irregular migrants. That's UN speak. We don't talk about legal and illegal, right? We talk about the regular way and the irregular way. And because it's a human rights focused response, we're not talking about a person being illegal, right? They're trying to stay safe and alive. They have human rights that should be recognized and centered in the process. So that's why we use the terms regular and irregular migration. So in the 23 actions that could be taken, it really focused on addressing root causes, providing humanitarian assistance, promoting safe and legal migration, strengthening international cooperation, and protecting migrants' rights. So good things do happen at the United Nations. when Pope Francis gave his speech there, just shortly before this, when he came to New York and spoke at the United Nations, even he acknowledged it's got its problems, but it's the best we got, is what he said in polite speak. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. And our office representing the Maryknoll sisters and the lay missioners and the fathers and brothers, we have staff who go to the UN in New York to represent Maryknoll's lived experience in 25 countries, and also in Washington, D.C. to speak with policymakers there. Pope Francis continues to give a clear, inspiring, and I want to say a doable message. And like St. Francis, sometimes the best way to preach is through your actions and not with words, right? So this image of the Pope washing the feet of migrants living at a shelter just outside of Rome caught the world's attention. Front page, New York Times. This is our response, as it should be. And he's quite active on Twitter, now known as X. Is he on Blue Sky? I don't know myself. Well, I wanted to highlight these two tweets because what great preaching in 140 characters, right? The Holy Father said, refugees are not numbers, they are people who have faces, names, stories, and need to be treated as such. And also, he said, I express my solidarity with migrants around the world and thank all those who help them. Welcoming others means welcoming God in person. And as the representative of a faith-based community, we center ourselves on Pope Francis's words here. Welcoming others means welcoming God in person. He is a source of hope and resilience, as are the migrants themselves. And also Maryknoll history is a source of hope and resilience. So I want to take you down a little trip of Maryknoll history, working and serving and ministering with migrants. And I want to begin with the Japanese internment camps during World War II. Maryknoll missioners were pastors and teachers for Japanese-speaking communities in the United States at that time. So when the order came for entire communities to move to the internment camps, the Maryknoll missioners went with their communities. They were pastors of churches and educators who ran schools. And these are some of them who were there together in the internment camps. This is a photo of Japanese Americans preparing to go to an internment camp. And this is actually the Maryknoll school playground where the buses came to pick up people. They established schools in the camps, and they led them and provided the administrators and teachers. They also provided pastoral care in chapels, and this is photos from a camp in Idaho. And then also Hong Kong was another place of a massive surge of refugees flowing into Hong Kong in the 1950s. You see, this is when the Maryknoll sisters were still wearing that habit. And they were just on the ground, responding to the needs of the refugees there in Hong Kong with schools and meeting basic needs. And in Central America in the 1970s, all through the 80s and 90s, the photo on the left is Maryknoll brother Marty Shea with a Guatemalan refugee girl, and on the right, Sister Maura Clark, back when she was still in the habit, when she was in Nicaragua in the 1970s. And then here she is again, wearing street clothes like the rest of us with Ida Ford when they moved to El Salvador, and we're working with Jean Donovan, and I'm sure you recognize their names as 3 of the 4 martyred church women. And they were serving displaced communities, internally displaced people who were victimized by their own government for recognizing their own human rights. And, you know, these sisters were persecuted and martyred for standing in solidarity and recognizing the sanctity of the human lives and human dignity of these people. Back at Maryknoll, New York, outside of New York City, at Maryknoll headquarters was providing sanctuary for a family. I'm trying to remember, were they from Nicaragua? In the 1980s, living there at Maryknoll, and the Maryknoll Sisters carry this on today. There's refugee families living on Maryknoll Sisters property today. This was the public statement that the Maryknoll Fathers and Brothers released. I'm sorry, it was a joint statement. We, the Maryknoll Sisters, Brothers, Fathers, and lay missioners affirm our support for the sanctuary movement. So this was 1985, where they were welcoming and standing in solidarity with Central American refugees. And here at the border, I don't know if you're aware, there was a Maryknoll border project led by Wes Cosgrove. That was a collaborative effort of the Maryknoll Sisters, Fathers and Brothers, and lay missioners from 1995 to 2007. And since then have always participated in the border mass. I'm sure you all enjoy that beautiful experience. Across the seas on the African continent, in Somalia, Maryknoll Sisters were ministering to displaced people in the 1980s. And then Tanzania in the 1990s received millions of people fleeing Rwanda. This is Maryknoll priest Dan Ullman, and here Father Dave Schwinghammer and Sister Leken Chen, a pastoral care for Rwandan refugees. And this is the camp. Again, this was similar to the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar. It felt like it happened overnight. And so it was the churches who were able to respond immediately and work collaboratively with government efforts, international efforts, to meet the needs of these desperate people. Now going to Asia, Thailand in the 1980s to present day now, Maryknoll missioners are there serving the needs of refugees coming out of Myanmar, also known as Burma. And right now today, I think we have a Maryknoll priest and lay missioner at the moment in Thailand, carrying on this work. Sister Ro Malazzo has ministered with Kurdish refugees in Iraq. In Cambodia, there has been lay missioners and sisters who have worked with vulnerable people who are displaced and vulnerable to human trafficking, trying to meet their needs and provide them opportunities so that they can stay safe and get out of their desperate circumstances. Hong Kong, Maryknoll Sister Lourdes here is standing in solidarity at a protest against the abuse that an Indonesian migrant has experienced. You know, in Hong Kong, there are many thousands of domestic help migrants, so labor migrants who have few rights and are very vulnerable to abuse from their employers. So according to the UN, as of June 2024, 122 million people are forced to flee. The story hasn't changed throughout history. Because of violence, poverty, well, now we recognize climate change driving global migration. So what is ours to do? Well, I think most of you here are already engaged, but I just want to state clearly, there are different ways you could accompany migrants welcoming them through your church or your community and helping to meet their immediate needs in your community. You could serve by giving your time, talent, treasure, or join me at the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns in raising your voice to policymakers who can make our systems and our programs more humane and just. So I'll stop there with a big thank you to all of you. And just, this is from the Vatican website. Migrants are our brothers and sisters in search of a better life. Amen.